Tonight we step onto dusty trade roads, the kind that stretch across mountains, deserts, and seas, paths so old the stones themselves feel worn thin by centuries of restless feet. You don't start this journey with jingling purses of silver or gold coins. No, your wealth is measured in tiny bundles wrapped in palm leaves, in dried pods and seeds that smell stronger than treasure. You inhale, and the air burns a little sweet, a little sharp. That's the power of spice, and in the age before refrigeration and endless supermarket aisles, these were not just sprinkles for dinner. They were medicine, perfume, aphrodisiac, and status symbol rolled into one. The kind of thing kings would send ships for, the kind of thing merchants would risk pirates for, the kind of thing people killed and died for. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this spice market if you showed up with only your modern wallet and a weak stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into the crowded market square of a medieval port city, maybe Alexandria, maybe Constantinople. It doesn't matter which, because the same smell greets you: pepper, cinnamon, saffron, clove, a perfume so thick it seems like the air is made of spice. You feel as if you could scoop it with your hands. Traders shout prices, and though silver clinks in pouches, the real bargaining is for things lighter than feathers but worth more by weight than metal. Saffron threads, brittle and red gold, fetch more than coins. Peppercorns, tiny and black, can be counted one by one like pearls. You reach for one peppercorn, rolling it between your fingers. To you it looks ordinary, tiny, shriveled, almost boring. Yet in this moment, in this place, it's so valuable that an ounce of pepper might buy you a sheep. Kings tax it, merchants smuggle it, and common people grumble that life without it tastes grey. Historians still argue whether pepper truly deserved its power or whether it was just a very clever scam of scarcity. A medieval pyramid scheme, except instead of crypto coins, you're stuck with a mouthful of spice that makes your stew burn. Past the pepper stalls you catch a whiff of saffron. Bright crimson threads are carefully weighed on delicate scales, each fiber harvested by hand from fragile crocus flowers. It takes thousands of blossoms to fill a single pouch. Imagine crouching for hours in a field, plucking flowers until your back aches, just to gather enough to flavor one nobleman's supper. A quirky tidbit: saffron was sometimes faked with shredded marigolds or even painted horsehair. You picture some poor medieval diner chewing a bowl of horsehair stew and pretending it tastes luxurious. The road you walk stretches beyond the market into deserts where caravans march in endless lines, camels carrying sacks of spice strapped to their sides. The men guarding them are armed not just with swords but with stories, tales of giant cinnamon birds building nests from bark, or nutmeg trees that could curse you if harvested without ritual. These myths served a purpose: keep outsiders confused, make the trade seem magical, and drive up the price. And you, walking along in your sandals, realize that half of what you're smelling is myth and marketing as much as medicine and flavor. You take a detour into a shipyard. Here, spices leave the desert and sail the sea. Wooden hulls creak as sailors load sacks, and you can almost hear the ocean groan under the weight of cinnamon bound for Rome or pepper headed for Venice. Some voyages never return, swallowed by storms or pirates. But when a ship does limp back into port, every sack of spice on board is worth more than its weight in silver. It's not unusual for merchants to earn fortunes from a single voyage, fortunes that can build palaces, bankroll wars, or, more commonly, be squandered on more spice. You laugh a little, because it's absurd. In your kitchen today, a jar of cinnamon costs a few dollars and hides in the back of the cabinet, ignored until you bake cookies. Back then, people would die for that jar. They did die for that jar. Empires rose and fell because of that jar. And here you are, yawning as you shuffle past the cinnamon stalls, letting the perfume mix with the cool night air. But you don't leave the market yet. No, you wander deeper, past the stalls selling fabrics, metals, and livestock. The deeper you go, the heavier the air becomes with spice. Some merchants keep their wares in locked chests, showing them only when silver appears. Others guard their sacks with blades. One man pours a handful of peppercorns into your palm, smiling knowingly, as if he's just placed a future in your hand. You almost expect him to wink and say, "Hold on to this, it's the Bitcoin of 1200 AD. The spices move on, following roads that crisscross continents, trickling into monasteries, palaces, and kitchens. They become symbols of wealth and power, not just because of their taste, but because of the effort it takes to bring them here, to your hand. Silver can be mined, melted, and stamped, but spices? They must be coaxed from flowers, dug from roots, scraped from bark. They wither in the sun, spoil in the rain, mold on ships. Their fragility makes them precious, and that fragility also makes your eyelids heavy. As you drift along the road, you see the trade routes mapped across your imagination like veins of gold, the Silk Road over mountains, the maritime routes across stormy seas, the desert trails where camels plod one careful step at a time. Every path whispers the same truth, that humans have always gone to ridiculous lengths for flavor, for a little thrill on the tongue. And you, quietly, are starting to see why. The market smell still clings to you, threads of saffron and pepper weaving into your dreams as the journey unfolds further ahead. Forward from the crowded stalls, following the faintest wisp of fragrance, something sharper and sweeter than pepper, something glowing red in the torchlight. Before you realize it, you are standing in front of baskets piled with fragile, thread-like strands, saffron. You lean closer and notice that each strand is as thin as hair, brittle enough to crumble if you so much as sneeze. And yet, here in this square, these threads are guarded like gold bars. You catch a merchant gently placing them on a scale, every fiber counted, weighed, and bargained as though it were a jewel. You picture the fields these came from. Imagine hills blanketed in tiny purple crocus flowers, blooming briefly under the sun, each one offering just 3 crimson stigmas. To fill the basket in front of you would take thousands upon thousands of blossoms, each picked by hand at dawn when the petals are still closed and moist with dew. And you're expected to pay with silver, maybe more, for the chance to sprinkle a few threads into rice or dye a robe a shade of royal gold. Historians still argue whether saffron was valued more as a culinary spice or as a dye for kings and priests, but either way, you realize you are looking at one of the most impractical forms of wealth humanity ever invented. You smile to yourself, because saffron was not only fragile but also scandalous. People faked it shamelessly. Merchants sometimes mixed it with dried calendula petals, shaved carrots, or the real crowd pleaser, strands of dyed horsehair. There's a quirky tidbit for you: at least one medieval city made faking saffron punishable by death. Can you imagine the trial? A man standing in chains, accused not of treason, not of theft, but of passing off horsehair soup as the real thing. That's the sort of crime that tells you just how valuable these threads were. You shift through the market, noticing how saffron wasn't just for food or fabric. Physicians wrote long lists of remedies: saffron for melancholy, saffron for fevers, saffron for bad digestion, saffron for heartbreak. Some believed it could prolong life, others swore it inspired laughter. In fact, ancient writers warned against too much of it, claiming saffron might make you laugh yourself to death. You take a cautious whiff and think, well, it does smell a little cheerful, but probably not enough to kill you. Still, you keep a safe distance, no sense in dying from giggles on the spice road. Traveling with saffron isn't simple either. Unlike peppercorns, which are hardy little marbles, saffron fades quickly in sunlight, wilts in humidity, and demands constant care. That meant caravans had to move quickly, carefully, and always under guard. You imagine merchants checking their bundles daily, terrified of mold, of theft, of careless fingers that might crush a fortune into dust. Saffron was as much a responsibility as it was a treasure, a commodity that could slip away if not handled with reverence. Your steps take you down a quieter lane, away from the noise of bargaining, and suddenly the story of saffron stretches further back. You remember that Cleopatra herself was said to bathe in saffron-infused milk, believing it enhanced her beauty and allure. Roman emperors sprinkled saffron on their couches, theaters, even on the streets before parades, so that citizens walked on a golden, fragrant carpet. Imagine being a common cobbler in Rome, watching nobles scatter spice on the ground just to crush it beneath their sandals. That is the absurd level of luxury saffron represented, wasting what others fought over simply to perfume the air. But here's the twist: saffron wasn't only a luxury for the rich. In some places, it trickled down into ordinary kitchens, appearing in stews and breads, even in ales. The middle classes stretched it as far as possible, mixing a thread here, a thread there, making it last. Yet, as much as they tried, saffron's scarcity always kept it shimmering just out of reach, a symbol of aspiration. It was like driving past a luxury car dealership today, rolling your eyes at the price tag, and still secretly wanting one. And still, not everyone agreed it was worth the obsession. Scholars debate whether its reputation outpaced its reality. Did saffron really heal wounds and hearts? Did it truly dye fabrics as well as claimed, or did people convince themselves of its power simply because it was so rare? Maybe the value was in the rarity itself, the shared illusion that these fragile threads were more precious than silver. You run your fingers across a strand, wondering if it feels valuable or if the whole world had just agreed to pretend. At this point, your stomach growls, and you picture saffron in food: paella glowing sunset yellow, Persian rice jeweled with pomegranate seeds, medieval pastries tinted gold as though baked by sunlight. The taste is hard to describe: earthy, floral, faintly bitter, a little like honey and hay having an elegant quarrel on your tongue. Once you've tasted it, you see why it inspired both devotion and fraud. It's delicate, and yet it lingers. As you leave the saffron merchant behind, the scent trails after you, a golden thread tugging you further along the road. Behind you, guards watch the baskets like hawks, ready to defend what could buy a noble's ransom. Ahead, the night deepens, and you sense that this was only one spice among many, one chapter in a much longer, richer story. But for now, saffron's glow is still clinging to your fingertips, a reminder that sometimes the most fragile things command the fiercest loyalty. You follow the saffron glow until it fades into the night air, and soon another scent drifts your way, sharp, pungent, almost sneaky. It stings the nose but somehow makes your mouth water. You recognize it: pepper. Black peppercorns, wrinkled and tiny, but commanding the kind of respect usually reserved for kings. You stop at a stall where baskets overflow with these little black beads, and suddenly you understand why entire wars have been fought over something so small. Pepper wasn't just a seasoning, it was the seasoning. For centuries, it was the most traded spice on earth, the one that never seemed to go out of style. Roman aristocrats hoarded it, medieval cooks demanded it, and Renaissance merchants grew so rich from it that the word pepper itself started slipping into everyday speech. You've probably heard someone called peppered with questions or an old bill described as peppercorn rent, all echoes of this obsession. You can't help but chuckle that these little black spheres were once the Bitcoin, the hot stock, the limited edition sneakers of their time. But as you hold a handful of peppercorns, you realize the story is darker. This spice was so valuable that it became a weapon of power. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese decided they didn't just want pepper, they wanted all the pepper. Their ships cut across oceans, forcing control over Indian Ocean trade routes, seizing ports, and strangling local merchants. Venice, which had grown fat off controlling the flow of pepper into Europe, suddenly found itself sidelined. Historians still argue whether the so-called Age of Discovery was truly about exploration or simply about who got to monopolize these wrinkled black beads. Spoiler: It was probably the beads. You picture the battles, ships firing cannons, soldiers storming spice warehouses, all to control something you can now buy in bulk at the grocery store for a few dollars. The absurdity makes you laugh softly. Imagine explaining to a 16th century merchant that one day pepper would come pre-ground in disposable cardboard shakers on every diner table. They'd probably faint right there, clutching their purse of coins. Quirky detail for you: pepper was once used as rent. In parts of medieval Europe, tenants literally paid their landlords in peppercorns. It sounds silly, like a fairy tale arrangement, but when you remember each peppercorn was worth its weight in silver, suddenly it makes perfect sense. You imagine walking up to your landlord today and dropping a single pepper shaker into their hand with a straight face. Tempting, isn't it? You stroll deeper into the pepper stalls, and the sheer scale of the trade hits you. Entire caravans once moved across Asia carrying nothing but pepper sacks. In India's Malabar coast, pepper vines twined up trees like greedy snakes, each vine producing clusters of green berries that would later be dried into black pearls of fortune. Farmers knew their worth, but foreign merchants always wanted more control, more profit, more spice than anyone else. Some historians even claim that the Portuguese obsession with pepper was so intense, it triggered conflicts that reshaped entire regions. Others argue it was less about pepper itself and more about the prestige of controlling the flow of something so coveted. But you aren't caught up in scholarly debate. You're simply standing in a market where the air burns with the sharp scent, where buyers haggle ferociously, weighing pepper on delicate brass scales as though handling gemstones. You notice one merchant slip a few peppercorns into his mouth, chewing with a grin, as if daring everyone to recognize just how rich he feels in that moment. You try the same with a single peppercorn. The taste is fiery, bitter, almost numbing. Your tongue tingles, your eyes water, and yet you want another. Suddenly you understand why medieval food was swimming in this stuff. It didn't just season, it transformed. You recall how pepper wasn't only about taste. Doctors recommended it for everything from indigestion to impotence. Some believed it could ward off the plague, though, to be fair, in those days people thought everything might ward off the plague. Others used pepper in perfume, in ritual, even in charms. It was everywhere, infiltrating daily life until it seemed less a seasoning and more a symbol of survival. And yet, there were skeptics. Some chroniclers accused the pepper craze of being overblown, of merchants artificially inflating demand. Historians still debate whether pepper was genuinely scarce or whether traders created the illusion of scarcity, hoarding it in warehouses just to keep the prices sky high. Either way, you realize people have always fallen for hype. Maybe pepper was the medieval version of paying too much for avocado toast. The crowd thickens around you, and you're jostled by men shouting prices, sailors unloading sacks, guards brandishing spears. It feels less like a market and more like a battlefield of silver and spice. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the crash of waves, reminding you that ships are waiting in the harbor, eager to carry this black gold across seas. The pepper wars never end, they just move from market to ocean, from city to city, until whole empires are built and broken on the backs of tiny wrinkled seeds. As you step away from the stall, your hands still smell faintly sharp, your tongue tingles with heat, and the air behind you vibrates with the noise of deals struck and fortunes made. You leave pepper behind for now, but you know it's only the beginning of the battles to come. The road ahead is long, the scents are richer, and every step takes you closer to spices even stranger and more fiercely guarded than this. You wander on, still feeling the pepper sting on your tongue, when suddenly the night breeze shifts. A fragrance floats in, not sharp like pepper but sweet, heady, almost intoxicating. You follow it, step by step, until you find yourself at the edge of the market staring at bundles of dried flower buds, cloves. They look unimpressive, like little brown nails, each one shaped with a bulbous head and a spindly stem. But the closer you lean, The more you realize why entire fleets once braved storms just to bring these to Europe. The smell is intense, sweet and fiery, as though the forest itself whispered a secret in your nose. Cloves came from a very specific corner of the world, the volcanic Maluku Islands, also called the Spice Islands, tucked away in the Indonesian archipelago. For centuries, no one outside those islands knew how to grow them. That made cloves a monopoly unlike any other. You picture tiny villages on volcanic slopes, trees heavy with unopened buds, harvested by careful hands before the blossoms bloomed. The harvesters knew their worth. They knew that somewhere across the sea, these tiny buds were worth more than silver. Here's a quirky tidbit. In China during the Han Dynasty, courtiers were required to chew cloves before speaking to the emperor, just to freshen their breath. Imagine that mandatory clove breath mints before meetings. In a way, cloves were the ancient tic-tac, except far more expensive and guarded with spears. The clove story isn't just one of fragrance and medicine, though. It's also one of blood. When the Portuguese stumbled onto the Spice Islands in the 1500s, they realized they had found paradise in miniature. They tried to lock it down, forts, cannons, treaties, but they weren't the only ones interested. The Dutch soon muscled in, waging wars, slaughtering villages, and enforcing brutal monopolies. Historians still argue whether the Dutch strategy was genius economic control or simply cruelty disguised as business, but either way, cloves became the prize at the heart of centuries of conflict. You trace your finger along a clove bud, and the smell clings to your skin. It was used for more than cooking. Medieval doctors praised it as a cure for toothache, stomach pain, even as an aphrodisiac. Perfume makers blended it into oils. Apothecaries stocked it like medicine. And cooks loved it. Drop one clove into wine, and suddenly the whole cup tasted like winter warmth. Bite into a roasted meat studded with cloves, and you'd feel the fire of islands you'd never seen. But cloves carried curses too. Locals believed the trees were sacred, tied to their very identity. In one story, every clove tree was planted with a child's birth, a living bond between family and land. So when foreign powers burned entire groves to control supply, they weren't just killing trees, they were tearing apart lives. You pause, and the sweetness of the spice suddenly feels heavier, as though you can almost hear the whispers of lost families beneath the fragrance. Still, cloves fascinated outsiders. They were tough to transport. If they got wet, they rotted. If they got too dry, they lost aroma. Merchants went to absurd lengths to protect them. Ships carried them in sealed containers, sometimes guarded more closely than gold. Imagine being a sailor, risking storms and scurvy, all to babysit sacks of dried flower buds. And when they finally arrived in Europe, nobles paid astronomical prices just to tuck a few into their kitchens. You laugh softly, thinking about modern mulled cider. You drop in half a dozen cloves casually, not realizing that a handful once represented a fortune. Another odd fact: cloves were sometimes carried as protective charms. People hung them around their necks, believing the spice warded off evil, disease, and bad luck. Children wore them in little pouches, like talismans. The irony, of course, is that cloves themselves became the source of plenty of bad luck, at least for those who lived in the islands where outsiders fought over them. As you walk away from the stall, the clove scent clings stubbornly, almost haunting. You glance back at the baskets, guarded by tired men with wary eyes, and you realize cloves were never just a seasoning. They were a crossroads of myth, medicine, monopoly, and misery. That's the thing about these forgotten spices, they're never just about flavor. They're about the lengths people go for desire, the costs hidden behind every fragrant pinch. Your feet carry you onward, the smell of cloves mingling with the pepper still on your tongue, and somewhere ahead, the cinnamon merchants are waiting. But that's a story for the next turn in the road. The cloves' perfume lingers on your clothes as you keep walking, but soon another scent curls through the night. This one is woody, warm, almost comforting, with a sweetness that reminds you faintly of toast and honey. You tilt your head and follow it, winding past barrels and baskets until you find long, curling strips of bark bound in bundles. Cinnamon. At first glance it looks unimpressive, just rolled bits of wood shaved from a tree, but don't let the simplicity fool you. For centuries, cinnamon was one of the great mysteries of the spice world, wrapped in myth, guarded by merchants, and traded at prices that could make a miser weep. You pick up one of the bark rolls, noticing how light it feels, how easily it flakes at the edges. The merchants here treat it with reverence, not letting customers paw at it too long. To them, every curl is treasure, and for a long time, no one outside of a small circle of traders even knew where it came from. The origins were guarded secrets, hidden behind layers of myth so wild you almost laugh when you recall them. The most famous legend said cinnamon was harvested by giant birds. Yes, enormous birds that built nests high on cliffs from branches of cinnamon trees. Merchants would place chunks of raw meat at the base of the cliffs, and the birds, greedy for the feast, would swoop down, grab the meat, and fly back up to their nests. The weight of the meat would break the nests apart, sending precious cinnamon branches tumbling down for the merchants to collect. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it worked. The story kept competitors confused, and it gave cinnamon the shimmer of magic. Historians still argue whether people truly believed the bird tale or if they just went along with it because the spice seemed too mysterious to explain otherwise. Of course, the real source was less dramatic. Cinnamon came from the bark of trees in Sri Lanka and southern India, carefully stripped, dried, and rolled into those familiar curls. Harvesters risked injury climbing trees and cutting bark just thin enough to curl, but not so deep as to kill the tree. It was delicate work, requiring skill and patience. And it made the merchants' tall tales even more amusing. Why admit to careful bark peeling when you could sell stories of mythical birds? Quirky detail for you: cinnamon was sometimes stored in temples, treated as sacred. In ancient Egypt, it was part of embalming rituals, used to preserve bodies and perfume tombs. The sweet smell of cinnamon was thought to keep decay and bad spirits away. You picture priests grinding bark into powder, sprinkling it over the linen wrappings of a pharaoh, as though sweet spice might trick death itself. In Europe, meanwhile, nobles crumbled cinnamon into wine, stews, and pastries, each pinch a sign of status. Too much, of course, and you risked showing off, like someone bragging about their fourth sports car. Moderation was fashionable. Overindulgence made you look insecure. As you walk through the cinnamon stalls, you notice the different grades. Some pieces are brittle and pale, others dark and oily, almost glowing in lamplight. The best cinnamon was reserved for kings and popes, carried in gilded boxes, locked in chests. You can imagine a medieval feast where roasted meats were dusted with cinnamon, not just for flavor but as a performance, a reminder to guests. Look how wealthy I am, I can afford to burn wood shavings on my dinner. But cinnamon wasn't only for the rich. Apothecaries touted it as medicine, a cure for coughs, colds, fevers, even heart troubles. Some said it sharpened memory, others believed it purified the blood. Historians still debate whether cinnamon had any real medicinal punch or whether people convinced themselves it worked because it smelled divine. Either way, you can almost picture someone sipping a hot cinnamon tonic, sighing with relief, half healed by spice and half healed by placebo. The trade itself was a tangle of secrecy and violence. The Arabs, for centuries, controlled cinnamon's flow into Europe. They told elaborate lies about its origins, keeping prices high, until eventually the Portuguese and later the Dutch muscled their way into Sri Lanka to seize the groves. Wars were fought not over gold mines but over trees that peeled like paper. For cinnamon, people died, ships sank, and empires schemed. And all for the privilege of flavoring porridge. You shake your head, it's almost comical, almost tragic. You take another curl of bark, snap it gently, and bring it to your nose. The smell is sharp, sweet, and calming all at once. It's easy to understand why the myths sprang up around it. Cinnamon smells like comfort disguised as luxury, like a promise that the world can be both sweet and rare. No wonder emperors wanted it, no wonder merchants lied about it, no wonder you can't quite put it down. As you place the bark back on the pile, the merchant nods at you knowingly. He doesn't need to sell you the story, you already feel it. Cinnamon, like saffron and pepper before it, was never just a flavor. It was a dream disguised as spice, a reminder that humans will chase beauty even when it's bound in brittle bark. The road stretches onward, and already another scent waits for you, sharper and darker than cinnamon's sweetness. The nutmeg traders are ahead, and with them, a story of dreams and nightmares. The cinnamon curls crumble in your memory as another fragrance takes over, richer, muskier, and oddly nutty. It's sharper than cinnamon, more mysterious than clove, and with a touch of warmth that makes you think of holiday desserts, but also of danger. You stop at a stall where brown, egg-sized seeds sit in neat piles, their surfaces smooth and glossy. Nutmeg. To you, it looks like nothing more than an oversized seed, the sort of thing you might skip past in a supermarket. But here, in this moment, nutmeg might as well be a crown jewel. You roll one in your hand, and it's heavier than you expect. When grated, it releases a perfume both sweet and spicy, a flavor that can transform an ordinary dish into something remarkable. In medieval kitchens, nutmeg was sprinkled into sauces, pies, even beer. It was considered not just a spice but a miracle, warming the body, cheering the heart, warding off disease. During the Black Death, people wore nutmeg amulets around their necks, believing its scent would keep the plague away. Historians still argue whether nutmeg was truly believed to be a plague cure, or if frightened populations just clung to anything with a strong smell. Either way, nutmeg necklaces became all the rage, a fashion accessory of desperate times. Quirky tidbit: in Renaissance Venice, people sometimes sniffed powdered nutmeg the way modern folks might sniff snuff or coffee beans. Imagine standing in a crowded ballroom while nobles discreetly inhale spice dust from tiny boxes. You'd wonder if everyone's secretly addicted or just suffering from very fancy seasonal allergies. Nutmeg's story, though, is not all whimsical. It has a dark underbelly. The seeds came from the Banda Islands, tiny specks in the Indonesian archipelago. For centuries, these islands were the only place on Earth where nutmeg trees grew naturally. That made them the target of Europe's hungriest empires. At first, the Portuguese showed up with trade offers backed by cannons. Then came the Dutch, who decided offers weren't enough, they wanted absolute control. They built forts, imposed brutal monopolies, and enforced contracts with blood. Whole villages were massacred, populations enslaved, and trees destroyed if they weren't under Dutch authority. The English tried to muscle in too, seizing a few nutmeg islands, which led to skirmishes not just in Indonesia but across the globe. One of the strangest consequences: the Dutch traded the island of Run, a tiny nutmeg island, to the English in exchange for a swampy island on the other side of the world, New Amsterdam. You know it now as New York. Yes, part of the reason Manhattan is because Europe was fighting over nutmeg. You toss the nutmeg seed gently in your hand and can't help but laugh at the absurdity. A handful of spice once rewrote the map of the world. Nations fought, people died, and empires rose all over something you now casually grate onto your eggnog. If that isn't the definition of misplaced priorities, what is? But nutmeg had another, more personal danger. Take too much, and it's toxic. Large doses can cause hallucinations, convulsions, even death. Some adventurous souls in history deliberately ingested nutmeg for its psychoactive properties, describing wild visions and euphoric dreams. Others, less fortunate, discovered only pain and regret. Historians still debate how widely known nutmeg's toxicity was in the Middle Ages. Did people intentionally risk overdosing for visions, or did they stumble into disaster thinking more spice meant more health? Either way, it gave nutmeg a reputation as both treasure and trap. You pause, imagining the Banda Islands, lush green forests, nutmeg trees shimmering in sunlight, and a world of innocence before European ships arrived. The locals harvested the seeds, dried them, wrapped them in protective mace, that fiery red covering you'll hear about soon, and traded them across Asia. To them, nutmeg was wealth, yes, but also identity. Then the world's hunger twisted it into a curse. Even so, nutmeg enchanted people everywhere it went. In England, it was a status symbol to own a silver grater and carry a nutmeg in your pocket. You could shave a little into your wine at a dinner party, casually reminding everyone that you were rich enough to waste spice like confetti. You smile at the thought. It's basically the medieval equivalent of showing off your luxury watch, except instead of diamonds, you carried a pocket nut. As the night deepens around you, you roll the nutmeg seed one last time, feeling its smoothness, sensing the shadows in its history. Dreams and nightmares bound in a single spice, luxury, death, visions, empire. When you place it back on the merchant's table, the smell clings stubbornly to your fingertips, a scent that whispers of both wonder and warning. Ahead, a scarlet shimmer catches your eye, the fiery covering that nutmeg wears, known as mace. You follow the glimmer, knowing the next chapter will be just as strange. The nutmeg's heavy perfume lingers in your mind as you step forward, and then you see it, a flash of red, delicate and lacy, wrapped around the very seeds you were just holding. It looks almost like fine silk spun around a nut, threads of crimson curling and twisting in intricate patterns. This is mace, the outer covering of nutmeg, a spice so striking that it feels less like food and more like jewelry. You lean closer, and the scent rises, warm, spicy, slightly floral, like nutmeg's more dramatic sibling. It's odd, isn't it? One tree produces not one but two luxury spices, each with its own role in the grand drama of trade. Nutmeg was the star, but mace, with its fiery red hue, was the showstopper. Its color alone made it valuable, and cooks quickly discovered it carried a flavor similar to nutmeg but more subtle, more refined. To sprinkle mace into a dish was to say, I don't just have wealth, I have taste. In medieval banquets, where presentation mattered almost as much as flavor, mace became a darling. It flavored meats, spiced sauces, and was even steeped in wine. Historians still argue whether its popularity was due to its unique flavor or simply because it looked luxurious and exotic, but either way, mace carved out its own place on the spice stage. Quirky detail: mace wasn't just a kitchen treasure. Apothecaries prescribed it for stomach troubles, liver ailments, even as a cure for flatulence. You imagine a medieval doctor solemnly grinding mace while his patient hopes a little lacy red powder will silence embarrassing noises. The blend of seriousness and absurdity makes you grin, and you realize that for all their reverence, people of the past were just as desperate for digestive relief as you are today. But don't let the whimsy fool you. Mace had a sharp edge in history. Like nutmeg, it grew only in the Banda Islands, and therefore fell under the same shadow of monopoly and bloodshed. The Dutch East India Company enforced strict control, often burning excess harvests to keep prices artificially high. Villagers who dared to trade outside Dutch approval were punished brutally. Some accounts describe entire villages emptied, trees hacked down, just to make sure mace and nutmeg remained rare. The scarlet lace you hold, so delicate, carries with it stories of violence, greed, and silenced voices. Still, when it reached Europe, mace was adored. It became a favorite in sausages, pies, and pastries. Bakers prized it for its warming quality, chefs for its subtlety. Nobles flaunted it, sprinkling it at feasts the way you might sprinkle parmesan today. It was a statement piece, a whisper of wealth wrapped in scarlet. In some places, It was even added to perfume and potpourri, filling chambers with its sweet and fiery aroma. And here's a little oddity: mace was sometimes believed to sharpen the mind. Students and scholars were encouraged to keep some nearby, inhaling its scent to improve concentration. You imagine a monk hunched over parchment, scribbling by candlelight, pausing to sniff a little pouch of mace for inspiration. Did it help? Historians still debate whether there was any real cognitive benefit or whether it was just medieval aromatherapy. Either way, the image of monks snorting spice in libraries is strangely endearing. As you walk past the mace stall, the red threads shimmer in the lamplight, glowing like embers. You realize how seductive it must have been to those who first saw it centuries ago. Not just a spice, but a symbol, a fiery veil promising warmth, health, prestige, and perhaps a little danger. It was luxury wrapped in fragility. You run your fingers lightly across a small heap, and for a moment you imagine yourself carrying a pouch of mace across the sea, each thread guarded more carefully than coins. You'd know that people were waiting, in far-off lands, to pay handsomely for a pinch of the scarlet lace. But you'd also know that every thread was tangled up with the darker side of empire. Spice wasn't just food, it was power. The road beckons again, and this time the air shifts from fiery to sweet, cool, and almost minty. Ahead, the caravans are heavy with green pods, nicknamed the Queen of Spices. Cardamom waits, ready to show you a new kind of allure. The scarlet shimmer of mace fades behind you, and in its place comes a lighter, fresher aroma, sweet, resinous, with a whisper of mint and citrus all at once. You follow it eagerly until you see them, little green pods, neatly bundled, some pale, some dark, each no bigger than your thumbnail. Cardamom. The merchants call it the Queen of Spices, and you understand why the moment you crush one pod gently between your fingers. The seeds inside release a fragrance so clean and uplifting it feels almost like stepping into a garden at dawn. Cardamom is different from the heavy, fiery spices you've met so far. It doesn't announce itself with power, it seduces with elegance. In the kitchens of India and the Middle East, it flavored everything from curries to sweet milk puddings. Drop it into coffee, and suddenly your morning cup tastes like luxury. Blend it into medicine, and the bitterness of herbs is softened by its sweetness. Even now, you think of cardamom buns in Scandinavian bakeries, each swirl carrying a secret inheritance from spice caravans centuries ago. But cardamom's story stretches further back than pastry. Ancient Egyptians chewed the seeds as breath fresheners and used them in ritual incense. The Greeks and Romans loved it as perfume. Wealthy matrons dabbed cardamom oil on their skin, leaving a scent trail wherever they walked. Quirky tidbit: in some texts, cardamom was considered so sensual it was labeled an aphrodisiac. Imagine a dinner party where the guests start side-eyeing the pudding nervously because someone's added too much spice. Still, the real drama of cardamom was in its journey. Unlike pepper or nutmeg, it didn't come from an isolated island. It grew across the lush forests of southern India and later in other tropical lands. That made it harder for any one empire to monopolize completely, though not for lack of trying. Caravans of camels trudged across deserts loaded with green pods, while ships carried it across seas. In medieval markets, cardamom was so prized that apothecaries kept it locked away, sold only in small doses, like rare jewels. Historians still argue whether its high price came from scarcity or simply its reputation as the most refined of spices. You imagine the trek, camels swaying under sacks of pods, drivers shielding their faces from sandstorms, nights by campfires where the air smelled faintly of roasting cardamom. Some of those pods would be ground into powders for royal feasts, others steeped into oils, and still others traded onward, crossing mountains into Europe. By the time they reached noble kitchens in Paris or London, their price had multiplied tenfold. A tiny jar of cardamom could equal a small fortune. But the spice wasn't all sweetness. Too much cardamom, some believed, could overstimulate the body. Doctors cautioned against reckless use, warning of fevers or heart palpitations. Whether those side effects were real or imagined, the warnings only added to its mystique. You can picture a medieval apothecary wagging his finger at a curious young customer. 1 pinch is a remedy. 2 pinches, and you may never sleep again. Cardamom's cultural trail is fascinating too. In Arabic coffee traditions, cardamom became essential. The bitterness of roasted beans softened by the floral spice turned a humble drink into hospitality's signature. Even today, in many Middle Eastern homes, offering coffee laced with cardamom is more than a drink, it's a gesture of respect and welcome. That thread stretches back centuries, a living reminder that spices shaped not just taste, but rituals of kindness and community. And here's an oddity you didn't expect. Cardamom was once believed to ward off snakes. Travelers sometimes carried it in pouches, convinced the scent would drive serpents away. You glance down at the dusty road beneath your feet, half smiling, half hoping it's true, because in the darkness of these ancient trails, you never quite know what might be slithering nearby. The stall before you glitters with piles of pods, green and fragrant, some cracked open to reveal tiny black seeds. A merchant hands you one, urging you to chew it. The flavor bursts, sweet, cool, slightly peppery, a little lemony, almost medicinal yet deeply comforting. It's unlike anything else you've tasted tonight. No wonder poets compared it to love itself, warming, intoxicating, and sometimes overwhelming. You hand the pod back and step away, the freshness still dancing on your tongue. You feel lighter, almost uplifted, but you know the journey isn't done. Ahead, the air thickens again, hotter this time, with a scent that burns at the edges. Ginger waits in the shadows, ready to show you its fiery bite. The sweetness of cardamom lingers in your mouth as you continue along the spice road, but now the air changes again, this time hotter, sharper, almost electric. A rooty tang rides on the breeze, and before long you're staring at knobby beige roots piled high in baskets, some still with streaks of fresh soil clinging to them. This is ginger. You bend down, pick up a piece, and feel its weight, solid, unassuming, like something you'd toss into a stew without thinking. But centuries ago, this humble root was anything but ordinary. Ginger was one of the earliest spices to travel the trade routes, carried from its native lands in South and Southeast Asia all the way to Rome and beyond. The Romans adored it, blending it into sauces, wine, and even bread. When the empire fell, ginger's glow dimmed a little in Europe, but during the medieval period it came roaring back, so much so that by the 14th century, a pound of ginger cost as much as a sheep. You can't help but chuckle. Imagine today trying to swap a sack of ginger for a whole live animal. Farmers might give you a look. One quirky tidbit: gingerbread owes its entire existence to this root. Medieval cooks blended ginger into honeyed dough, pressed it into elaborate molds, and served it at fairs. Over time, those little spiced cookies evolved into the gingerbread men and houses you know today. The idea that a medieval noble might have been handed a gingerbread knight, complete with armor details pressed into dough, makes you grin. Somewhere in that history, ginger leapt from medicine cabinet to fairground treat, and the world never looked back. Medicinally, ginger was a marvel. Physicians prescribed it for nausea, indigestion, even the plague. Some travelers carried ginger root as a talisman against seasickness. You imagine a sailor clutching a little piece of ginger like a lifeline, muttering prayers between heaves as the ship rocks. Historians still argue whether the spice was valued more for its medical benefits or its flavor, but in truth, it probably didn't matter. Ginger simply worked its way into every corner of life. And the trade? Ginger moved everywhere. Caravans hauled it across deserts, ships ferried it across oceans, and markets lit up at its arrival. Unlike nutmeg or mace, it wasn't bound to one tiny island, it was cultivated in multiple regions, which made it slightly more accessible. Still, The demand was so great that prices stayed high. European households measured ginger carefully, a pinch here, a slice there, each use a reminder of wealth. To bake with ginger was to tell your guests, "I can afford this." It was a soft boast, hidden in the spice of a cake. But ginger wasn't only food or medicine, it sometimes crossed into myth. In China, it was thought to warm the body's inner energy, making it essential for balance. In Europe, some whispered it could stir passion or even extend life. You picture a medieval lord tossing ginger into his wine goblet with the casual hope of cheating time. Did it work? Well, judging by the lack of 500-year-old nobles still wandering about, probably not, but at least their wine tasted lively. Here's the funny part, not all ginger went straight into mouths. Sometimes it became candied, coated in sugar, and served like luxury sweets. Picture a medieval banquet where, after the roasted peacock and spiced sauces, guests are handed little glittering chunks of candied ginger. The sweetness softens the fiery kick, creating a treat that's both exotic and addictive. And you realize, candy hasn't changed much at all, it still carries that little thrill of indulgence. Ginger also sparked some peculiar trade anecdotes. In Elizabethan England, Queen Elizabeth I supposedly had her cooks invent the very first gingerbread men as a playful gift for visiting dignitaries. Imagine biting into a cookie shaped like your political rival, equal parts delicious and insulting. That quirky tradition spread, eventually becoming holiday fun instead of political shade. As you hold the root a little longer, you notice its rough skin and pale, juicy inside. It's not beautiful like saffron threads or mace lace, but it doesn't need to be. Ginger is blunt honesty wrapped in spice. It tells you straight up, "I'll burn your tongue a little, but I'll make your food sing, I'll settle your stomach, and maybe, just maybe, I'll earn you a few extra years." The root's fiery aroma clings to your hands as you set it back on the pile. Around you, merchants haggle, buyers carry away sacks, and you hear laughter at a nearby stall selling candied ginger to children tugging at their mother's sleeves. The spice feels alive, woven into both celebration and survival. Yet just beyond the ginger market, another scent rises, familiar but not quite the same. You catch a whiff of pepper, but sharper, stranger, like pepper with a twist. That's long pepper, once as famous as black pepper, now nearly forgotten. And it waits for you just a little farther down the road. The heat of ginger lingers on your lips as you move forward, and then you smell something eerily familiar, pepper, but not quite. It's sharper, smokier, almost medicinal. You round a corner and see it, clusters of wrinkled, finger-like spikes, brownish and dry, looking a little like miniature cattails. This is long pepper. Today, most people wouldn't recognize it if they saw it at a market stall, but for centuries it was the pepper. The original. The prized cousin of the black peppercorns you know so well. You pick one up, turning it in your hand. The tiny bumps are actually the fruit of the plant, each one carrying a fierce punch of flavor. Bite into it and you'd get not just heat, but layers earthy, slightly sweet, with a faint tingle on the tongue. In ancient Rome, long pepper was everywhere. Wealthy Romans sprinkled it lavishly over meats and stews. Apicius, that flamboyant Roman gourmet, included it in recipe after recipe, often alongside honey and vinegar to balance its sharpness. To impress guests in his dining room, a host didn't just bring out wine, he brought out dishes heavily dusted with long pepper. Here's the quirky part. Long pepper was once so precious that it was measured against silver. During the late Roman Empire, a single pound of long pepper could cost the equivalent of a skilled worker's monthly wage. Imagine being told you'd have to work all month just to afford a sack of seasoning. You might politely decline and stick with plain porridge. As centuries rolled on, long pepper held its grip. Medieval Europe valued it as much as, if not more than, black pepper. Apothecaries sold it as medicine, believed to cure fevers, digestive troubles, and even melancholy. Some thought it sparked courage in the timid, others that it could chase away demons. Historians still argue whether its reputation in medicine outweighed its culinary fame, but either way, its influence was undeniable. And yet, long pepper's fate took a strange turn. Around the 15th century, black pepper, its cousin, began to dominate the trade. Black peppercorns were easier to grow, easier to store, and easier to ship. Long pepper, with its delicate spikes and fussier harvesting, slowly slipped into obscurity. By the time the age of exploration came into full swing, merchants and cooks alike had largely forgotten it. Black pepper became king, and long pepper was relegated to the dusty footnotes of spice history. You can't help but feel a little sorry for it, like an older sibling who was once the family favorite but got overshadowed by the younger, flashier star. Still, long pepper left its fingerprints. Its presence in medieval recipe books shows up in spiced wines, sauces, and even desserts. Some recipes specified long pepper by name, while others simply said pepper, leaving later scholars scratching their heads. Which kind did the cook mean? The ambiguity keeps food historians awake at night, well, awake in their libraries, at least. You imagine them grumbling over a Latin manuscript, muttering, did they mean long pepper or black? This matters. In South Asia, though, long pepper never vanished completely. Ayurvedic medicine still prizes it for its warming qualities, prescribing it for coughs and colds. Mixed into certain blends, it remains part of a living tradition that stretches back thousands of years. The irony is rich. While the Western world forgot long pepper, the very cultures that first nurtured it kept it alive quietly in their kitchens and pharmacies. You lift the spice to your nose again, the sharpness tickling your senses. For a moment, you imagine being a Roman merchant, nervously guarding sacks of long pepper on a journey across the Alps, each sack worth more than its weight in silver. A single spill on the road, and you'd have lost a fortune. Or picture a medieval cook in Paris, sneaking a pinch into a sauce, knowing the flavor would thrill their noble patrons. Long pepper was once power, wealth, and mystery packed into a spiky little cone. Today, it sits humbly at your fingertips, almost forgotten. You set it back down gently, as though acknowledging its lost glory. Around you, the marketplace shifts again, and you feel the air thicken with another scent, woodsy, smoky, and oddly bittersweet. Ahead, bundles of brown sticks are stacked in neat piles, their curls catching the light. Cinnamon awaits, ready to pull you into its warm embrace. The sharpness of long pepper still tingles on your tongue as you wander onward, and then a new fragrance sweeps over you, sweet, woody, almost like warm bread fresh from the oven. You follow your nose to neat stacks of curled brown sticks, some tied with twine, others spilling from woven baskets. This is cinnamon, one of the most beloved spices of all time, yet one whose history is tangled in myth, deceit, and outright comedy. You pick up a piece. It feels light, fragile, its surface layered like parchment rolled into a tight scroll. Break it, and the scent rises instantly, comforting, gentle, yet with just enough spice to spark your senses awake. Modern kitchens take cinnamon for granted, but in the ancient and medieval worlds, these little sticks were almost magical. Egyptians used cinnamon in embalming, blending it with myrrh and resins to preserve the bodies of pharaohs. For Romans, it was luxury incarnate. An emperor might burn more cinnamon in a single funeral pyre than a citizen could afford in a lifetime. Picture that, entire fortunes literally going up in fragrant smoke. You can't help but smirk at the thought of a Roman accountant muttering, "There goes next year's tax revenue," in the air. Here's the quirky detail. Ancient traders were so secretive about cinnamon's origins that they flat out lied. For centuries, Europeans believed cinnamon grew inside nests of giant Arabian birds, which risked their lives to gather it. Merchants told wild tales of these birds hoarding cinnamon sticks high on cliffs. Supposedly, to collect the spice, traders lured the birds with chunks of ox meat, which they carried to their nests. The nests collapsed under the weight, and cinnamon rained down. Historians still argue whether these myths were pure invention or clever marketing tricks to guard the true sources. Either way, it worked. Nobody really knew where cinnamon came from until much later. In reality, the best cinnamon grew in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and parts of southern India. Arab traders controlled the routes for centuries, fiercely guarding their monopoly. They sold cinnamon to Europeans at staggering markups, letting the legends obscure its origins. To medieval buyers, cinnamon seemed almost supernatural, a spice from some distant, dangerous edge of the world. And in their kitchens, it found a home in everything from stews to sweet wines. One of the most fascinating uses was in medieval potages, thick soups often spiced with cinnamon to mask less than fresh meat. It's hard not to laugh at the image of a nobleman praising his cook's culinary genius, while the cook quietly thanks cinnamon for hiding yesterday's questionable leftovers. Beyond the kitchen, cinnamon was a staple in apothecaries. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, sore throats, and weak hearts. Some even recommended it as a breath freshener. Long before breath mints came along, cinnamon was the medieval version of popping a tic-tac. But cinnamon wasn't only prized for taste or health. It carried symbolic power. To gift cinnamon was to honor someone with wealth. To burn it in rituals was to bridge earthly and divine. Kings collected it as tribute, and merchants hoarded it as portable fortune. By the 14th century, cinnamon was common enough in European markets to appear in middle-class households, yet still precious enough to mark status. Owning cinnamon was like owning a little piece of the wider world. And then came the battles for control. When Portuguese explorers finally reached Sri Lanka in the early 1500s, they discovered cinnamon's true homeland. Their eyes practically bulged at the groves of cinnamon trees. Determined to seize the trade, the Portuguese colonized the island and forced the Sinhalese people into harsh systems of cultivation and harvest. Later, the Dutch pushed the Portuguese out, and then the British muscled in. Cinnamon wasn't just a spice, it was an empire builder. The tug-of-war for control stretched on for centuries, and the trees themselves bore silent witness to conquest after conquest. Today, of course, you sprinkle cinnamon on your latte without a second thought. You bake it into rolls, dust it over oatmeal, stir it into cider. The warmth it brings feels homely, not regal. Yet the story in your hand, the brittle curl of bark once worth more than silver, whispers of wars, myths, and fortunes built on flavor. You set the cinnamon stick back in its pile, brushing the fragrant dust from your fingertips. The scent lingers, cozy and familiar, like a friendly ghost. But already, another aroma teases the air, earthier, darker, less sweet. Ahead lies cassia, cinnamon's rougher cousin, once mistaken for the real thing, and a reminder that not every expensive spice lived up to its reputation. The sweetness of cinnamon still hangs in the air as you move on, but now something heavier greets you, thicker, earthier, almost medicinal. You see bundles of bark piled in uneven heaps, darker than cinnamon, the curls thicker and less delicate. This is cassia, cinnamon's cousin, often confused with it, often sold as it, and at times valued nearly as highly. You bend to pick up a piece. It's denser, sturdier, with fewer paper-thin layers. Snap it, and the aroma rises, still warm and spicy, but with a deeper, rougher edge, like cinnamon wearing a leather jacket. Cassia has long played the understudy to true cinnamon, yet its story is anything but minor. Ancient Chinese texts mention cassia as far back as 2700 BCE, listing it among valuable medicinal plants. In traditional Chinese medicine, cassia bark was believed to warm the body, drive out chills, and stir sluggish energy. Later, as the spice trade linked Asia and Europe, cassia traveled westward and often masqueraded as cinnamon. To many medieval buyers, the difference was invisible or perhaps irrelevant. You imagine a medieval grocer winking as he slipped cassia into a sack labeled cinnamon, pocketing the extra coins without guilt. One quirky tidbit: cassia was so intertwined with cinnamon that even Roman writers couldn't always separate them. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century CE that cinnamon was expensive beyond reason, but he admitted that much of what passed as true cinnamon was probably cassia. Historians still argue whether the Romans could genuinely tell the difference or if they just didn't care, so long as it tasted exotic and expensive. To them, bark was bark, and bark that made dinner taste less like boiled goat was worth the price. In medieval Europe, cassia became common in spice blends like poudre d'ouse and poudre forte, which cooks sprinkled into sauces, pies, and mulled wines. Whether diners got cinnamon or cassia often depended on supply, connections, and how much a merchant wanted to charge. Apothecaries, meanwhile, sold both under overlapping names, prescribing cassia for ailments from indigestion to cold humors of the spleen. It's amusing to imagine a medieval patient diligently chewing bark for their spleen and proudly reporting that they felt warmer already. But cassia wasn't just a stand-in. In some parts of the world, it was the preferred spice. In China, cassia remained more available than cinnamon and was widely used in medicine, cooking, and rituals. In fact, many of today's cinnamon sticks on supermarket shelves are actually cassia. Ceylon cinnamon is rarer and milder, while cassia dominates global markets with its stronger, spicier bite. Without realizing it, you've probably been sprinkling cassia on your toast all along, while thinking it was cinnamon. Surprise, you've been an unknowing cassia fan your whole life. Cassia's high value also made it a diplomatic gift. In the 7th century, Arab traders carried it across the Red Sea into Egyptian markets, where it became part of offerings to rulers and temples. Some records suggest cassia was even used in religious incense, mingling with frankincense and myrrh. Imagine a temple filled with smoke that smelled like someone's kitchen had just baked a cassia-spiced pastry. Sacred, yes, but also strangely delicious. The rise and fall of cassia's fame mirrors that of its sibling spices. For centuries, it was expensive enough to be measured against silver, yet eventually it spread so widely that its price fell. Once precious, it became common. And yet, its story is tangled with deceit. Merchants in medieval Venice often blended cinnamon and cassia, selling the mix at premium prices. Some even invented elaborate grading systems to confuse buyers: true cinnamon of the highest order, royal cinnamon, ordinary cinnamon, all while quietly slipping cassia into the sacks. Historians suspect that few buyers could tell the difference once the bark was ground into powder. And that's the real twist. Cassia was everywhere, hiding in plain sight. It flavored stews, perfumed wines, and slipped into medicines. It fueled markets, voyages, and fortunes, while always living under cinnamon's shadow. It was the imposter spice, the substitute that became the standard. You can't help but chuckle at the thought that the so-called fake cinnamon has outlived its fancier cousin in popularity. The joke's on us. Really, we've been buying cassia for centuries and loving every bite. As you set down the heavy bark, your fingers still dusted with its powdery flakes, you feel the air grow sharper again. There's a dryness now, almost citrusy, but also pungent, like something both bright and biting. Ahead, slender roots are laid out in bundles, their knobby surfaces pale and crooked. This is galangal, the ginger's cousin once treasured by apothecaries and cooks, its price high enough to spark heated debates over whether it was worth the silver. The cassia dust still lingers on your fingertips when a new scent slices through the air, peppery, citrusy, almost medicinal, with a sharpness that makes your nose twitch. You follow it to crooked pale roots stacked in neat bundles, their surfaces rough and ridged like knuckles. This is galangal, ginger's fiery cousin, a spice that once made its way into medieval kitchens and apothecaries, commanding prices that could outmatch silver. You bend closer and catch the fragrance again, ginger-like, yes, but brighter, sharper, with hints of pine and lemon. It's the kind of aroma that could wake you up faster than a double espresso. Galangal comes from Southeast Asia, where it has long been cherished in cooking and medicine. In Thai cuisine, it's still a star ingredient, giving tom yum soup its signature kick. But centuries ago, Europeans had no idea what to make of it. They lumped it in with ginger, though any cook with a functioning nose could tell them apart. By the 12th century, galangal had entered European trade routes, appearing in herbal manuals and pharmacy lists. Apothecaries prescribed it for stomach troubles, heart complaints, and even as a cure for bad breath. Imagine a medieval knight chomping down on a chunk of galangal before meeting his lady-love romantic, if you overlook the fact that she probably flinched at the medicinal tang. The quirky detail here is how galangal's fame spread thanks to one very influential man, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and herbalist. She praised galangal as the spice of life and recommended it for everything from indigestion to strengthening the heart. In her writings, galangal becomes almost mystical, a plant blessed with divine power. Historians still argue whether her reputation alone catapulted galangal into European vogue, or if trade patterns would have made it popular regardless. Either way, when Hildegard spoke, people listened and galangal enjoyed its golden era. In the medieval kitchen, galangal often found its way into sauces, stews, and wine. Recipes from French and English cookbooks of the 13th and 14th centuries call for it alongside cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. One sauce, known as galantine, was thickened with breadcrumbs, spiced with galangal, and poured over roasted meats. You can almost taste it rich, tangy, and pungent enough to mask even the gamest venison. Of course, masking was a common theme. You keep circling back to that image of medieval nobles praising exquisite flavors, while spices like galangal politely covered up the less-than-fresh reality of the meat. Galangal's value rose because it was relatively rare. It had to be dug up in far-off Southeast Asia, dried, and transported through countless hands before reaching Europe. Each step inflated the price. By the time a root reached the spice markets of Venice, its worth rivaled that of silver coins. Imagine carrying a pouch of roots at your belt as casually as someone today might slip a phone into their pocket, only in this case, you could literally trade those roots for goods. One more amusing tidbit, galangal was believed to stir passion. Some medieval texts describe it as an aphrodisiac, a spice that could heat not just the stomach but also the heart. Wink, wink. You can picture a nervous courtier slipping galangal into a goblet of wine before offering it to his beloved, silently praying she wouldn't notice the strange taste. Whether it worked or not, we'll never know. What we do know is that galangal's reputation for heating the body stuck around for centuries. But as with so many spices, galangal's star eventually dimmed. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as trade expanded and European tastes shifted, galangal lost ground to ginger, which was easier to cultivate and more familiar. Ginger became the household staple. Galangal became the exotic cousin people forgot about. Today, outside Southeast Asia, galangal is rarely mentioned in the same breath as cinnamon or pepper. Yet once, it was precious enough to fill cargo holds, sweeten royal dishes, and earn the nickname spice of life. You set the knobby root back on the pile, brushing the earthy dust from your palm. Its scent clings stubbornly, sharp and citrusy, as if determined not to be forgotten. But already another aroma curls through the air, darker, heavier, almost smoky. Ahead, you see baskets filled with wrinkled brown pods, their surfaces brittle and cracked. This is cubeb, the pepper that once teased palates across Europe before vanishing into obscurity. Its story is strange as its flavor. The citrus tang of galangal still buzzes in your nostrils when something smokier takes over, a deep, resinous pepperiness that feels both familiar and unsettling. You move toward wicker baskets brimming with small, wrinkled brown berries, each with a thin stalk still attached. At first glance, they look like regular black peppercorns, But their aroma tells another story. Pepper, yes, but tinged with camphor and a lingering bitterness, like pepper that stopped at the apothecary for cough syrup before coming to dinner. This is cubeb, once the darling of medieval Europe, later banned in some places, and now almost forgotten. You pick one up, rolling the berry between your fingers. When you bite down, the taste hits sharp and biting, followed by a cool, lingering aftertaste that feels oddly medicinal. No wonder apothecaries loved it. Cubeb, native to Java and other Indonesian islands, was long cultivated under the watchful eye of Arab traders, who guarded their monopoly fiercely. By the 10th century, cubeb had found its way into Middle Eastern medicine, prized for treating respiratory complaints, indigestion, and even melancholy. And because melancholy was a favorite diagnosis for just about any mood, cubeb found plenty of patients. Europe's love affair with cubeb took off in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the spice entered cookbooks and pharmacy shelves. Cooks sprinkled ground cubeb into sauces, stews, and pastries. It often appeared alongside cinnamon and cloves, giving dishes a peppery punch with a cooling aftertaste. Imagine biting into a meat pie, expecting a familiar peppery warmth, only to be surprised by a sudden minty bitterness sneaking in at the end. That's cubeb, culinary plot twist in every bite. One quirky detail stands out. Cubeb became especially fashionable among monks and scholars. Some records show it was used as a breath freshener, chewed like a lozenge. You can picture a monk pacing the cloister, quietly crunching cubeb berries to sweeten his breath before prayers. Historians still argue whether this use was practical, medicinal, or simply an excuse to indulge in something costly under the guise of holiness. After all, what's holier than fresh breath? But cubeb's path wasn't all smooth. By the late Middle Ages, its popularity began to wobble. Some European authorities frowned upon it, dismissing it as overly exotic or untrustworthy. At one point, Pope John XXII even banned cubeb from appearing in certain church prescriptions, calling it unnecessary and wasteful. Imagine being told your favorite spice was now officially sinful. Yet people didn't give it up so easily, demand lingered, and cubeb continued to sneak into kitchens and apothecaries alike. The 16th century brought new waves of competition. As black pepper became more affordable thanks to Portuguese sea routes, cubeb lost its competitive edge. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves hogged the spotlight, while cubeb sulked in the wings. By the 17th century, it was fading from recipe books. Still, it didn't vanish entirely. In some corners, it held on, especially in medicine. Apothecaries prescribed cubeb for everything from urinary tract infections to coughs. In fact, cubeb lozenges were still being sold as late as the 19th century. And in a curious twist, cubeb made a comeback in the 20th century, not in kitchens, but in cigarettes. Yes, cubeb cigarettes were marketed as soothing for sore throats. Nothing says medicinal remedy like a pepper-flavored smoke break. Yet in the medieval world, cubeb had once been a symbol of sophistication. Nobles who could afford it added it to their dishes to show refinement, much like sprinkling gold leaf on desserts today. It was pepper, but elevated pepper with a mysterious, exotic twist. You smile at the thought that what was once luxurious enough to rival silver now sits forgotten in a corner of culinary history, its bitterness too strange for modern palates. You place the wrinkled berry back into the basket. Its camphorous tang lingers on your tongue, cooling and unsettling, a ghost of the spice's forgotten fame. The market seems quieter now, the piles of precious goods fewer as you near the end of this journey. Ahead, though, a warm, nutty fragrance beckons you. On low wooden trays lie smooth, oval seeds, their scent both rich and delicate, like almonds and roses combined. This is cardamom, one of the most refined of all the spices, a seed so treasured that entire trade networks bent around its little green pods. The camphorous bite of cubeb still cools the back of your throat as the air softens with something far gentler, warm, floral, and almost creamy. You follow it to shallow wooden trays lined with smooth oval pods, pale green to sandy brown, each split just enough to show the tiny black seeds inside. The scent is unmistakable. Cardamom, the queen of spices, elegant where pepper was brash, delicate where cubeb was bitter, yet every bit as expensive as silver in its heyday. You pinch one pod and roll it between your fingers. A fragrance rises, sweet like honey, sharp like eucalyptus, and soothing all at once. For centuries, cardamom has been treasured in India, where it flavored curries, sweets, and chai-like brews long before Europeans had the faintest clue. In Sanskrit texts, cardamom appears in recipes and medical writings, praised for its ability to sweeten breath, ease digestion, and cool the body. By the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, cardamom was already slipping westward, carried by Arab traders through Red Sea ports. To the Roman elite, cardamom was both a kitchen spice and a perfume ingredient, something you might sprinkle on roasted meats in the evening and dab behind your ears before attending the bathhouse. The Middle Ages saw cardamom reach new prestige. When it appeared in European markets, it wasn't just expensive, it was shockingly rare. Few traders dared to transport it over such long, dangerous routes, so each pod became a miniature fortune. In aristocratic kitchens, cardamom flavored sauces, pastries, and mulled wine. Imagine a Christmas feast in a stone hall, where the air smells not just of roasting boar but of cardamom-spiced hippocras, a wine so fragrant it could distract even the most battle-scarred knight from his meat platter. And then comes the quirky tidbit: cardamom was once considered an antidote for overindulgence. Medieval medical texts suggested chewing it after heavy meals or nights of wine. In other words, it was the tumps of the Middle Ages. Historians still argue whether this advice was based on real observation of digestion or simply the spice's soothing aroma tricking people into feeling better. Either way, you can picture a nobleman, groaning after too much venison pie, fishing out a cardamom pod as discreetly as possible while the minstrel strummed in the corner. Arab traders kept a tight grip on the cardamom trade for centuries, controlling not only its price but also its mystique. To Europeans, the origins of cardamom were as mysterious as a fairy tale. Some believed it grew only in Arabia, guarded by serpents. Others imagined it came from distant Indian forests no outsider could survive. In truth, cardamom thrived in the lush hills of Kerala, cultivated in gardens that still exist today. But secrecy was good for business, and so the myths persisted. When the Portuguese muscled into Indian waters in the 16th century, they quickly recognized cardamom's value. Along with pepper and cinnamon, it became one of their most coveted exports. By then, cardamom's reputation had spread even further east, carried to Persia and the Ottoman Empire, where it flavored coffees and sweets. Coffee with cardamom, still a tradition today, was seen not just as a drink but as a social ritual, a fragrant pause in daily life. You can imagine the first sip, warm and spiced, soothing the senses after hours of bargaining in a noisy bazaar. Cardamom never entirely lost its prestige. Unlike cubeb or long pepper, it survived changing tastes, clung to cuisines, and slipped comfortably into both sweet and savory dishes. Even today, it remains one of the most expensive spices by weight, nestled in saffron's elite company. Yet its journey from the forests of India to silver-priced cargo in European ports tells the same story you've traced all night. Small things, easily overlooked, once held empires in their thrall. You set the pod back down on the tray. The scent lingers, soft, floral, persistent. The market around you seems to dim, as though the lanterns are flickering lower. You've walked past cinnamon and saffron, cloves and cubeb, each one once worth its weight in silver, each one now reduced to dusty jars on grocery shelves or tucked into tea bags. You've followed the trail of forgotten fortunes, of roots and pods that shaped global trade, toppled cities, and made kings impatient. And now, as the scents fade one by one, the night itself seems to lean closer, urging you to rest. You've wandered through centuries, markets, ships, and kitchens. The clamor of merchants, the creak of caravans, the laughter at noble feasts, all of it softens into a distant hum. The journey is almost at its end, and your body feels heavier, slower, as if the spices themselves are whispering you towards sleep. The market is quiet now. The stalls are empty, lanterns dim, and only the faintest traces of cinnamon and cardamom linger in the cooling air. You step slowly, each movement softer, as though your body itself has remembered how to drift. The night folds gently around you, thick as velvet, and the scents of all the spices, sharp, sweet, bitter, and floral, mingle into one fading memory. You let your breathing slow, each inhale drawing in calm, each exhale releasing the chatter of centuries. The stories you've carried of saffron fields, clove forests, pepper caravans, begin to blur like dreams dissolving at dawn. There's no need to hold on. The past is still there, patient, waiting in the shadows of forgotten spice jars, but for now, it asks nothing of you but rest. Your eyelids are heavy. The hum of history softens into silence. The air cools. And as the last traces of spice drift away, you let yourself sink deeper, slower, until there is only stillness.